The fog had come in overnight, thick and low and smelling of the river, and it had not lifted by the time Dorothy Pembridge opened the door to take in the morning milk. She nearly stepped on it. It sat on the stone step as though it had been placed there with great deliberation, or perhaps with none at all. Small enough to fit in both palms together, round, slightly flattened at the crown, made of silver gilt with a band of strawberry leaves alternating with balls, a coronet unmistakably, and not the decorative kind. She bent down and lifted it. The metal was cold from the night air, and the weight of it surprised her, the way real things always did when you had only seen their imitations. She looked both ways along the street. The fog gave back nothing. A dray horse clopped somewhere to her left, invisible, and a lamp burned in a window across the way. But there was no figure retreating, no pair of boots disappearing into the white murk. Whoever had left it was already gone. She brought it inside and set it on the table beside her father's old inkstand, the one she had kept when everything else was sold. And she stood looking at it for a long time. On the underside of the fourth leaf, she turned it, examining the assay mark, the small struck hallmark that told her it was silver gilt and not plate, that it had been made by someone with a license to make such things, and there was a scratch, recent, crossing the leaf at a slight diagonal. It had been dropped or set down carelessly on a hard surface. It was not costume jewelry from a masquerade. It was not a trinket. It was a peer's coronet, and someone had left it on her doorstep, and there was no note. She heard two women pass on the pavement below the window as she stood there, their voices carrying in the fog with the particular clarity that damp air produces. The Pembridge girl, yes, no family worth speaking of. Father was a country solicitor, and now she has nothing to recommend her except that she is useful. A capable young woman with no particular prospects. Mrs. Haverfield has been very kind to bring her. The other woman made a sound of sympathy that contained more satisfaction than feeling, and their steps moved on. Dorothy did not move for a moment. Then she folded her hands together, looked at the coronet, and thought about the assay mark. If you are wondering who in Bath had occasion to carry a silver gilt earl's coronet through the fog at some hour before dawn and set it on the wrong doorstep without a word of explanation, stay with this story. He had his reasons. He had, in fact, better reasons than he knew at the time. Bath in the spring of 1812 was full of people who were somewhere they did not entirely wish to be. This was the nature of Bath. You came to take the waters when your joints ached, or when your nerves required relief, or when the season in London had not produced the result you required, or when the entail on your cousin's property needed a solicitor's opinion, and the only competent solicitor in the family had recently died, and left behind a daughter who knew the law better than the clerk who had inherited the practice, but could not practice it. Dorothy had come because Mrs. Haverfield, who had been her mother's dearest friend, and who now occupied a comfortable set of rooms in Royal Crescent, had written 3 weeks after the funeral to say that her niece required a companion for the season, and that Dorothy was the most sensible woman of her acquaintance, and that the alternative was to hire someone she did not know. Dorothy had accepted because the alternative to accepting was to stay in the house in Wiltshire and watch Mr. Craik, her father's clerk, catalogue the library. She was 24 years old. Her father had taught her to read contracts before she could ride. She had spent 3 years entering and verifying the accounts of his small practice, noting the errors in his correspondence, catching the discrepancies in the land surveys before they reached the county registry. She had done this quietly, in the back room, because it was not possible for a woman to be employed as a solicitor's clerk, and it was not possible for a woman to appear before a court, and it was not possible for a woman to sign her own name to a professional document. She had done it anyway, and her father had paid her in the currency available to him. He told her she was competent. He had also told her, with the particular honesty of men who love their daughters and do not know what to do with them, that she was a capable young woman with no future in it. He had said this with grief. It had landed with grief. She had carried it, as she carried most things, without letting it show. She had been in Bath 3 weeks when the Coronet appeared. She had seen the Earl of Clavering at the lower rooms on her second Thursday. Across the floor during a country dance she had watched from a chair near the pillar, because Mrs. Haverfield's niece, Miss Cecily, was dancing, and Dorothy was present to be useful. He had stood on the far side of the room beside a window, and he had not danced once. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a coat of very dark blue that fit him as though it had been made with care rather than money, though it had clearly been both. His face was not conventionally handsome. It was composed. It gave the impression of a man who had learned, at some cost, to arrange himself so that nothing moved without his permission. Mrs. Haverfield had leaned toward Dorothy and said, "The Earl of Clavering. Just returned from Portugal. Something to do with the crown, no one is entirely certain what. He was married once, briefly. The young countess died in childbed. He has been abroad nearly since." Dorothy had looked at him across the room. He was not looking at her. He was looking at nothing in particular. With the focused inwardness of a man carrying a weight too familiar to examine. She had not thought of him again until the morning of the Coronet. The discreet notice appeared in the Bath Chronicle 2 days after the Coronet arrived. It said only that a small, silver-gilt object had been inadvertently mislaid in the vicinity of Trim Street on the morning of the 14th, and that the owner might apply to the offices of Messrs. Hartley and Sons in Milsom Street for its return. Dorothy read it at breakfast. She read it twice. She then went to her trunk and took out the Coronet, which she had wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked beneath her second-best shawl, and she sat with it in her lap and thought about what kind of man lost a coronet in the fog without noticing. A man who carried it absently, the way you carry things you have owned so long you no longer see them. Or a man who carried it in a coat pocket that had been worn too many times, whose lining had given at the seam. Or a man who had meant to leave it somewhere and in the fog had left it at the wrong address. She went to Hartley and Sons at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday. The clerk looked at her with the expression clerks reserved for women who came to solicitors' offices without a male relative. She told him she had come about the mislaid object. He asked if she was certain she had the right office. She said she was. He asked if she had come on behalf of someone. She said she had not. He went away for a long time and came back with a man behind him. The Earl of Clavering was slightly taller in a well-lit room than he had appeared across a ballroom floor. He stopped when he saw her, and something crossed his face too quickly to read, and then his expression settled back into its careful arrangement. "Miss Pembridge," said the clerk, consulting a paper. "Of Trim Street." "Yes," said Dorothy. The Earl looked at her. She looked at him. She was aware of the handkerchief in her hands, and of the weight inside it, and of the fact that she had now met this man's eyes, and that they were the color of still water in shade, gray with a tint of something she could not name. "I believe this belongs to you," she said. She held it out. He did not take it immediately. He looked at the handkerchief, and then at her. And then he reached out, and took it, and unwrapped it carefully, as though the object inside might have changed. It had not changed. He turned it slowly in his hands, and found the scratch on the 4th leaf, and his expression tightened by 1 degree. Very slightly. The way a man's expression tightens when he has confirmed a thing he already knew. "How did you know to come here?" he said. The notice did not describe the object. The notice said a small silver-gilt object in the vicinity of Trim Street, Dorothy said. I knew what I had found, and I could determine what it was worth. A coronet with a strawberry leaf band is an Earl's coronet. The assay mark gave me the Maker's Guild and the decade. I concluded the owner was unlikely to be impoverished and would place a notice rather than simply accept the loss. He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. "You read the assay mark," he said. "I was a solicitor's daughter," she said. "I learned to read what was available." He was quiet again. The quality of his silence was not rude. It was the silence of a man reformulating something. He asked her to allow him to express his thanks in a more substantial form, and she said that was entirely unnecessary. He said he felt the debt was not discharged by a recovered object, and she said the object was not hers to give, and she had simply returned what belonged to him. He looked at her once more, the kind of looking that was not quite staring and not quite examination, but something in between, something that required a name she did not have for it. And then he thanked her properly, and she left. She was on the pavement and halfway toward the corner when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find him there. "Forgive me," he said. "I have just recalled. I did not ask. Are you well established in Bath? Have you people here?" "I am companion to Miss Haverfield," Dorothy said. "Mrs. Haverfield has been kind enough to include me in her party." "Good," he said. And then, as though the word had escaped him, "Good." He went back inside. She walked the rest of the way to Royal Crescent, with the handkerchief still in her hands, empty now. The weight of the coronet transferred back to its owner, and she could not have said why the morning felt different from the one before it. She did not have long to examine the feeling. She had barely reached the bottom of the steps at Royal Crescent when she heard her name. Gareth Pembridge was her father's cousin's son. He was 29 years old, pleasant-looking in a way that did not survive close attention, and he had arrived in Bath the previous week with a letter from a London solicitor making certain assertions about a debt her father had owed his family's estate. Dorothy had read the letter 3 times. The claim was imprecise in the way fabricated claims were imprecise, relying on the general authority of legal language rather than on specific instruments. She had been composing her counter-argument for 4 days. He was standing at the foot of the steps, and he was not alone. 2 women she recognized from the Haverfield circle stood nearby, and he addressed her at full volume with the satisfaction of a man who has chosen his audience carefully. "Cousin Dorothy," he said, "I had hoped to find you. I was just telling Mrs. Poole that you are a capable young woman with no particular prospects, which makes the matter of your father's estate all the more pressing. We ought to have it settled before the season ends." The 2 women looked at her. Dorothy looked at Gareth. "Good morning," she said. She went inside. The pump room at Bath was open in the mornings, and on cold days it was warm, and it had alcoves. This was relevant because Dorothy had taken to going there an hour before the crowds arrived, when the waters could be taken in near quiet, and she could sit in an alcove at the far end with her writing case and attend to the correspondence that Gareth's letter required without being observed. She had been at it for 30 minutes on a Wednesday morning, the letter from the London solicitor before her, and her draft counter letter half finished at her right hand, when she paused and crossed out a phrase and wrote it again. The statute she was citing was the correct one, and she had her father's copy of Blackstone in her trunk, had been keeping it since she was 14. But the phrasing she had originally used suggested the objection came from ignorance rather than from knowledge of the law's specifics, And that was not the impression she intended to make. She rewrote it. She read it back. She crossed out 2 more words and replaced them with better ones. She did not hear him come in. She did not see him cross the room. She did not know there was anyone in the alcove sight line at all until she looked up to consult the letter and found that a man was standing by the near column, not quite in the alcove, at an angle from which he could see the papers before her. He was not reading them. He was watching her work. She met his eyes. He did not pretend he had not been watching. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said. "You have not disturbed me," said Dorothy. He looked at the counter letter without approaching. "A legal document?" "A letter addressing a legal claim," she said. "Which amounts to the same thing." He said nothing. He looked at her hands on the paper, at the precise lines of her crossings out, at the stack of her notes at the left edge of the writing case, organized by the small system she had developed, tallest to the back, most recently consulted at the front, and he was quiet in the way he had been quiet in the solicitor's office, the way of a man not withholding speech so much as considering it carefully before spending it. "You do this work yourself," he said. "My father taught me," said Dorothy. "The law does not recognize the instruction, but the instruction is there regardless." He looked at her once more, and this time the quality of his attention was so different from the quick, careful assessment at the solicitor's office that she felt it as a physical thing, a slight change in the temperature of the air on her skin, and she looked down at her counter letter and wrote another sentence to give her hands something to do. He excused himself without ceremony, and she sat for a long time afterward, the pen still in her hand, listening to the water in the pipes below the floor. You know what she did not allow herself to consider. She knew what he was. She knew what she was. She knew the geography of the distance between them. She had been in Bath 6 weeks, and she had met him precisely twice, in circumstances that were each accidental in their own way, and his interest in her was the interest of a careful man in an unexpected thing. Nothing more. She knew the shape of the season. She knew the shape of her own situation. She had been told, at regular intervals, what she was worth on the market, and the sum was not one that purchased expectations. She did not permit herself to form expectations. She picked up her pen and finished the counter letter. He saw her cousin Gareth 3 days later. It was the lower rooms again, a Thursday evening. Mrs. Haverfield had taken her party, and Dorothy had danced once with a young clergyman who was visiting his aunt and who apologized repeatedly for his footwork. Gareth had arrived shortly after 8 o'clock and had found Dorothy near the refreshment table, and had begun, with the patience of a man who believes time is on his side, to rephrase the terms of his claim in a way that ended each time with the suggestion that she sign a preliminary acknowledgment of the debt, which he happened to have with him. She had said no 4 times in varying forms when a hand appeared at the edge of her vision, resting on the back of a nearby chair, and a voice said, quiet and level, "Do not give that man your signature." It was not addressed to her. It was not addressed to Gareth. It was spoken into the middle distance, in the conversational tone of a man remarking on the weather, and yet it was entirely clear who it was for. Gareth turned. Dorothy turned. The Earl of Clavering was not looking at either of them. He was looking across the room. He had a glass in his hand. And he was entirely relaxed, the way a man is entirely relaxed when relaxation is a form of authority. Gareth said, "I beg your pardon, are you?" "No," said the Earl, and walked away. Gareth's face worked through several expressions. Dorothy looked at her hands. A warmth had crept into her face that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the flat certainty in those 4 words, the complete absence of explanation, the way a man speaks when he is not asking, but rather simply telling the world how things are. She did not give Gareth her signature. He called on Mrs. Haverfield the following Tuesday, which was a correct social call and entirely unremarkable. Mrs. Haverfield received him in her front drawing room with the composed pleasure of a woman who has been hoping for exactly this and intended to appear to have expected nothing at all. Dorothy was present because she was always present when guests called. She sat near the window with some mending, which was the appropriate occupation for a companion, and she attended to it with more focus than the mending required. He had brought the coronet. He set it on the table between them without preamble, wrapped in what appeared to be a piece of green baize from a writing table. "I meant to have it reassayed while I was here," he said. "I found I could not." He looked at it for a moment, and then at her. "I wanted to return it properly. You kept it safe." "It was an easy thing to keep," Dorothy said, which was not entirely true. She had taken it out of the trunk twice and turned it in her hands, looking at the scratch. "Did you have far to carry it that morning? You must have come some distance to leave it on the wrong step in the fog." "I came from Pulteney Street," he said. "I was going to Hartley & Sons before they opened. I had a letter in my pocket and I meant to review it on the way." A pause. "I was not attending to what I was carrying." Mrs. Haverfield, with the discretion of a woman of 40 years' social experience, found something to look at outside the window. Dorothy looked at the coronet. "The scratch," she said. "Was it already there when you set out that morning?" Something happened in his face. A small thing, but specific. "No," he said. "That happened on the step, when I set it down." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not set it down on purpose. I was reading the letter, and I did not realize I'd put it down until I was halfway to Milsom Street." "What was in the letter?" she said, and then heard herself and said, "Forgive me. That is, it was from a solicitor in Wiltshire," he said, "about my cousin's property." He looked at the coronet. "It is not a sad letter. Nothing in it was a surprise." He paused again, in the particular way that meant something further was coming that he had not decided to say. "I brought the coronet with me from the house, because I intended to have the assay redone. I had not handled it in some time." She waited. "It was on my wife's dressing table," he said, "the morning I left for Lisbon." He said it precisely, as though precision were a form of control. She was entirely well. I had no reason to believe, there was no reason to suppose the journey was... She was entirely well when I left. The room was very quiet. "She was not," he said, "when I returned." Dorothy looked at his hands on his knees. They were completely still, the stillness of a man who has learned not to move when he is saying a thing he cannot afford to feel moving through him. She thought of what Mrs. Haverfield had said in the ballroom. Died in childbed. She thought of 4 years in Portugal. She thought of the careful arrangement of his face, the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something so long it has become part of his posture. "I am sorry," she said. There was nothing else that was true enough to say. He looked at her. The gray of his eyes in the light from the window was less still than she had thought, she noticed. Not still water, but something in motion under a composed surface. "I am told it becomes manageable," he said. "In time." A beat. "It has been 4 years." She said nothing. She did not offer him the comfort of agreed-upon phrases. He picked up the coronet, turned it once, set it back on the baize. "You should not have had to find it," he said. "I am sorry for the inconvenience." "It was not an inconvenience," she said. And then, because it was true, "I was glad to have something interesting to think about." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the muscle memory of a smile, appearing before the mind had given permission. He looked down at the baize and adjusted it 1 degree, and then he looked up again. If you have ever sat very still and felt a thing approaching that you were not prepared to want, you know what the next few minutes were. He stayed another quarter of an hour. He spoke to Mrs. Haverfield about the waters and to Dorothy about her father's practice, and he listened in the attentive way that meant he would remember what she said. And when he left, he bowed correctly to both of them and went. Dorothy sat for a long time afterward with the mending in her lap. The season thickened in the weeks that followed. Lady Clavering had arrived in Bath midway through April, as she arrived every spring, and she had brought with her opinions about her son's situation, and a young woman named Miss Honoria Blythe, who was everything the season produced in its most polished form. Lovely, accomplished, connected to 3 families in Parliament, and entirely certain of her own value. She was not unkind. She was simply a woman who had been told so many times that she was the correct choice that she had come to experience her own desirability as a natural fact, the way one experiences gravity. Lady Clavering spoke of Dorothy at a morning call to Miss Blythe, privately, while Dorothy was in the next room helping Cecily Haverfield with a letter to her mother. A capable young woman with no particular prospects, the Countess said. The kind of connection that does a man no good and him no credit. She is pleasant enough, one supposes, but pleasant is not sufficient to recommend a woman who brings nothing to a match. Dorothy did not move. She finished Cecily's letter and sanded it and folded it without speaking, and she thought about assay marks and crossed out phrases and the weight of a thing in both hands when it was real. Lady Clavering's dinner was on a Thursday evening, and Dorothy attended it because Mrs. Haverfield had been invited, and she went where Mrs. Haverfield went. And because declining would have required an explanation, she did not have. There were 14 people at the table. Gareth Pembridge was one of them, which surprised Dorothy, and then, on reflection, did not. Lady Clavering had an efficient mind. The inclusion of Gareth in her dinner party served the same function as the arrangement of Miss Blythe at her son's right hand, which was information presented as social fact, a statement about the value of the available alternatives. The meal passed without incident. Dorothy sat between an elderly baronet with a passion for turnip cultivation and a clergyman she had met before. She spoke when spoken to. She ate the pheasant and declined the syllabub. She watched, from the far end of the table, the Earl of Clavering speak in low tones to Miss Blythe, who laughed at something he said with the trained ease of a woman who has been told that charming men is part of her purpose. She did not permit herself to feel anything specific about this. It was in the drawing room afterward that Gareth found his moment. He had waited, she thought, until Richard was visible across the room, speaking to Lady Clavering. Until there were enough people present to constitute an audience without being so many that the scene would attract outside notice. He drew a paper from his breast pocket and held it out to Dorothy with an expression of grave regret that had been practiced, she thought, in a mirror. I received this from the estate this week, he said. I did not wish to distress you, cousin, but it is your father's hand. I am sure you will recognize it. She took the paper. She read it. It was a letter, dated 3 years prior, written in what appeared to be her father's script, acknowledging a debt of £480 to the Pembridge family estate. The script was wrong. Not wrong in any way that an inattentive person would notice. Not grossly wrong, not badly forged, but wrong in the specific way that she, who had copied her father's correspondence for 3 years, who had corrected his drafting and learned the exact pressure he placed on his descenders, recognized immediately. The G in the closing signature hooked inward. Her father's G never hooked inward. It was an open letter, a characteristic her father had developed in his 20s and never changed. She folded the paper and held it. "I did not want to press the matter publicly," Gareth was saying, in the tone of a man who had chosen the public drawing room of a countess specifically for this purpose. "You do see that it must be resolved." The room had settled, in the particular way rooms settled when a performance was taking place, into a listening quiet that was not silence. Lady Clavering was across the room. She looked at Dorothy with the composed expression of a woman delivering a considered verdict. "It is a difficult situation," she said. "For a woman without resources, these matters press heavily. I am sure we all feel for Miss Pembridge's position." She paused. "A capable young woman, as I understand it. A pity there is so little to be done." Dorothy looked at Richard. He had gone very still. He was looking at the paper in her hands, not at her face, and his jaw had set in that particular way she had seen once before. In the solicitor's office, when something had confirmed a thing he already knew. His solicitor, Mr. Hartley, was at his elbow. Richard leaned and said something very quiet to him. He did not cross the room to her. He did not move toward her at all. Mrs. Haverfield was at Dorothy's side in a moment, her hand at Dorothy's arm, warm and certain. "We will address this tomorrow," she said quietly. "Not here, and not now." Dorothy nodded. She said good night to Lady Clavering. She said good night to the room. She did not look at Richard again. She lay awake until 2 in the morning, and then she rose and wrote a letter to a household in Bristol that had been offered to her 6 weeks ago. A family requiring a governess, 2 young daughters, a house with a walled garden. She had declined it because she had been in Bath. She wrote to inquire whether the position remained open. It did not occur to her, not once in all those hours, that Richard had said something to his solicitor about the G in the signature, that he had recognized the forgery before she had, that he had stood still in that drawing room not because he had accepted Lady Clavering's verdict, but because he was already planning how to dismantle it, and he had made the catastrophic error of assuming she could see what he was doing. She left Bath on the Friday morning coach to Bristol. He discovered she had gone at 9 o'clock on the Friday morning, when he called at Royal Crescent, and Mrs. Haverfield met him in the front room with an expression that was not unkind, but was not warm either. "You stayed and spoke to Hartley," she said. "I recognized the forgery," he said. "The signature was false. Hartley had Pembridge correspondence from the original engagement, and we compared them that night. The matter is being addressed." Mrs. Haverfield looked at him steadily. "And did Miss Pembridge know that you had recognized it?" He was quiet. "She watched you stay still," Mrs. Haverfield said, "in that room, while Lady Clavering gave her verdict." "I see," he said. "Where has she gone?" "Bristol. The coaching inn on the Great Road, and then the Alderton household on Clifton Lane. She had a position waiting. She was efficient that way. He was on the road within the hour. He found her at the coaching inn at 2 in the afternoon. An hour before the hired post-chaise she had arranged was due to arrive. She was in the inn's small front room, sitting with her trunk at her feet, reading, with the focused attention of a woman who was keeping herself occupied by main force. She looked up when he came in, and something moved through her expression, quickly, and was replaced by the composure she had learned in rooms where composure was the only armor available. "Lord Clavering," she said. "Miss Pembridge," he said. He took the chair across from her without asking. "The letter was a forgery. Hartley confirmed it last night. Gareth Pembridge will be removing himself from Bath before the end of the week. and he will not be pressing any further claims against your father's estate. The matter is closed." She looked at him. "I know it was a forgery," she said. "I knew before you did." "I know," he said. "I know you knew." "Then why are you here?" she said. He had prepared an answer. He had composed it on the road. A sufficient answer. A correct answer. To inform her of the resolution. To assure her that the claim was concluded. To offer his assistance in recovering the situation. The answer had seemed adequate at 10 o'clock on the road to Bristol. It did not seem adequate now. "Because you left," he said. She looked at him with the clear-eyed attention of a woman who has been told practical truths all her life and learned to receive them without flinching. "I left because I watched you stand still in that room while Lady Clavering delivered her assessment of my situation," she said. "I have been assessed before. I have been told what I am worth before. I did not expect it to matter so much in that particular room, with you in it." The thing he had been carrying for 4 years, the careful arrangement of himself, slipped 1 degree. "I was speaking to Hartley," he said. "I know that now," she said. "You did not know it then," he said. "And I should have. I should have crossed the room first and spoken to Hartley after. And I did not. I chose the practical action. I always choose the practical action." He stopped. "My wife was entirely well when I left for Lisbon," he said. "I chose the practical action then as well." The room was very quiet. "Those are not the same thing," Dorothy said. "No," he said. "They came from the same place." She looked at her hands on the book in her lap. He looked at his hands on his knees. The quality of the silence between them had changed. The way silence changes when 2 people are no longer performing equanimity at each other, but are simply sitting with what is true. "Stay here," he said. "Come back to Bath. I will speak to Mrs. Haverfield and we will manage the rest of it correctly." He paused. "Please." She looked up. "You said you would speak to him," she said. "Come back to Bath and manage the rest of it correctly." "What does correctly mean?" "It means," he said, "that I intend to court you, Miss Pembridge, if you will permit it, in the full sight of everyone who was in that drawing room on Thursday evening, including my mother." He stopped, "Starting with the lower rooms on Friday next, if you are willing." She was quiet for a long time. A long time. The fire in the small hearth shifted and settled. "I am not a polished match," she said. "No," he said. "I have no family, no particular fortune, and a habit of citing statutes at inconvenient moments." "I am aware of all of those," he said. "I was watching when you cited them." She looked at him. He looked at her, with the unguarded quality she had now seen twice in the drawing room at Mrs. Haverfield's when he spoke of Lisbon, and now the quality of a man who has stopped arranging his face. "I will come back to Bath," she said. "I will not go to the lower rooms on Friday if it feels manufactured." "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. She did not go to Bristol. The post-chaise arrived and she sent it away. He did not ride directly back to Bath. He stayed in the inn's front room for another hour, on the grounds of having ridden some distance and the horse requiring water. She was still reading. Or she appeared to be reading. He did not comment on this. The Saturday assembly at the lower rooms was not, by Bath standards, a notable occasion. The usual people were present. Lady Clavering was in her position near the fireplace, Miss Blythe in pale gold, Gareth Pembridge not present, which several people noted. Mrs. Haverfield had her customary table near the east wall. Dorothy was beside her in a gown of cream muslin with a deep blue sash, her hair dressed simply, because she did not own elaborate jewels, and did not feel the want of them. She had been there 40 minutes when Lady Clavering found her way to Mrs. Haverfield's table. She sat down without being invited, which was her prerogative of rank, and she looked at Dorothy with the expression of a woman who has made an error and does not intend to be the one who names it. "Miss Pembridge," she said, "I trust your father's affairs are in order." "They are," Dorothy said. "The claim was found to be without foundation." Lady Clavering looked at her for a moment. "My son," she said slowly, "is a man of strong feeling and poor expression. He was always so." She stopped. "I would not have him make a mistake." "Nor would I," said Dorothy. Lady Clavering looked at her with something that was not warmth exactly, but was a kind of attention that preceded warmth when a woman allowed herself to be surprised. The conversation did not continue. It did not need to. Richard entered the lower rooms at 8:30 with Mr. Hartley at his side, and he crossed to Mrs. Haverfield's table in 3 deliberate strides that carried the attention of the room with him, the way authority carries attention, not demanding it, simply producing it. His mother was at the table. He looked at her, and then at Dorothy. "Miss Pembridge," he said, "will you dance with me?" It was not the calibrated line. That came next. He had offered his hand, and she had stood, and they were on the floor. And Miss Blythe was on the far side of the room watching, and Lady Clavering was very still. And Gareth Pembridge, who had not left Bath after all, had appeared in the doorway at the wrong moment, and in the held breath of the lower rooms on a Saturday in late April, Richard turned to face the room with Dorothy's hand in his, and he said, "Miss Pembridge is spoken for, by me, and willingly." 12 words. No more than necessary. Nothing poetic in them, nothing elaborate, nothing that could be recanted or reinterpreted. The room heard them as the room hears things that cannot be undone, with a collective small stillness. And then the rustle of conversation resuming, and then the music starting again. Lady Clavering's face went through something complicated and settled, after a moment, into something that was not capitulation, but was not resistance either. It was the expression of a woman who had made an error and would now prefer to proceed as though she had not. She looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at her. Miss Blythe, to her credit, moved away with considerable grace. Gareth Pembridge left Bath on the Sunday coach. They danced twice, which was sufficient to constitute a public statement. He held her hand in the correct position and moved with a care that was not uncertainty, but rather attention, the way he moved through everything. She was aware of his hand through her glove. She was aware of exactly where his shoulder was in relation to hers. She was aware, in the specific way that had been true since the solicitor's office, of the space he occupied and the quality of his attention, and the fact that both of these things were, at present, directed entirely at her. She said nothing for the length of the first dance. At the beginning of the second, she said, "You practiced that line." "Twice," he said, his voice low. Hartley felt it needed a third iteration. I disagreed. The corner of her mouth moved. He saw it. A week later, Mrs. Haverfield's small parlor was warm from the fire and smelling of the hyacinths that Cecily had put in the window, and Dorothy was sitting in the chair she had come to think of as hers, the one nearest the grate, and the coronet was on the mantel. Richard had brought it that morning when he called. He had set it beside the clock without comment, the way you set something down in a place it has decided to live. He was in the chair across from her. Mrs. Haverfield had found, as she did, a reason to be in another part of the house. Dorothy looked at the coronet on the mantel, at the scratch on the 4th leaf, visible from across the room if you knew where to look. "Was it an accident?" she said. "Truly. You were reading the letter, and you set it down without thinking, on the wrong step in the fog." He was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that she had learned to read, in the weeks since the assembly, with increasing precision. This was not the quiet of evasion. This was the quiet of a man examining a thing honestly before he answered it. "I was thinking," he said, "about the letter." A pause. "I was also thinking about the address I had passed the previous evening. The small house in Trim Street. I had seen you come out of it when I was going to Hartley's, and I did not know why I had noted it as precisely as I had." She looked at him. "I am not saying I intended to leave it," he said. "I am saying I am not entirely certain that I did not." She rose and went to the mantel and picked up the coronet. It sat in both her palms the way it had on the first morning, real and cold and weightier than it appeared, with the scratch on the fourth leaf that it had acquired on her doorstep in the fog. She turned it once. The silver gilt caught the firelight and held it. She held it out to him. He reached up and took it from her, and his hands closed over hers for a moment before taking it. Warm and very still, the way he was still when something mattered. He set it back on the mantel. He did not let go of her hands. Outside it was raining, the late April rain that would finish the season and empty Bath by the 1st of May, and the hyacinths were in the window, and the fire was the specific warm color of fires in houses where you have been given permission to stay. The coronet stood on the mantel where he had put it. The scratch on the fourth leaf caught the light every time the flames moved. She stood where she was. He looked at her, with the unguarded quality that no longer surprised her, because she had understood by now that it was not vulnerability, but accuracy. The face of a man who had learned that careful arrangement cost more than it protected. It had not been an accident. Not entirely. She was glad. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story found you in the right way, leave a thought in the comments below. There are more where this one came from.